Hi, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is April 26, 2021. Tonight's format, for those of you that might be newer to this process, is a live question and answer. So if you're a live audience member right now, you can submit questions at any time. I have a handful of questions left over from our last broadcast, so I'm going to get to those first, and then we'll get any live questions that have come up. If you're asking for and in behalf of a sibling or an extended family member, or if you are a sibling or an extended family member, let me know of your relationship. And if you're under the age of 25, let me know that also. That kind of helps me to cater my answer to the audience a little bit better. So I'll start off with this first question. It looks like a comment. Somebody writes, I just want to thank you, Dr. Reedy, because what you teach is priceless. I've been listening to your webinars and reading your book since 1 year ago, and I'm little by little able to listen and help myself with issues of my own childhood. And I feel less scared about what is going to happen with my son. I feel better, and that's for sure. And thanks to you and to God. So thank you so much for that. I'm glad to hear that it's making a difference. When you sit on this side of things and you're just talking to a little tiny green dot at the top of your screen, it's nice to have those human connections. So I really appreciate it. The next comment or question reads, my son is a teen and not very empathetic, nor has he ever been. Is it still possible to learn empathy if not learned at an early age? Yeah, developmentally speaking, teens tend to be self-centered. Children in general tend to be self-centered. And so, in other words, that's a simple way of saying it's developmentally appropriate for your son to be non-empathic, as strange as that might sound. I have a couple of thoughts about empathy that I'll share in just a moment. But developmentally speaking, we start to see that. In fact, I think it changes throughout adulthood, but we start to see that as children mature into early adulthood. Somewhere between 18 and 25, we start to see increases in that. I think one of the principal ingredients in the development of empathy for our children, at least one that we have some say or contribution or control over, is how well we take care of ourselves, how well we are able to establish and create boundaries for ourselves. See, I say this a lot, but I'm going to repeat it for this question. When you are a self, or I should say, to the extent that you are a self, your own person, able to take care of yourself, able to say no, able to set boundaries, then your children have to learn to deal with an other. Right? They have to deal with another person with needs and preferences and likes and dislikes and willingness and so forth. So oftentimes in our attempts to be selfless, I think sometimes some of my work is interpreted that way. Some people hear it that way, that when I talk about developing capacity, being able to hold our children, I think some people think that I'm speaking to this idea that we need to have no needs, and that's not at all true. We learn to be there for others until we can't, or unless we can't. And that's a sign to us. If we start getting angry, triggered, short-tempered, if we start to, in other words, act out on the other people in our lives, our children, our spouses, our employees, our coworkers, and so forth, our customers, if we start to act out on people, then it's often a sign that we're not really taking good care of ourselves, because we're kind of punishing people for not taking care of us, or becoming passive aggressive because they can't read our mind, or they won't do what we would do in that situation. So being a self and developing a practice of healthy self-care and limits and boundaries is an important contribution to empathy. The second great contributor to empathy is the ability to listen to how somebody feels. To not, in other words, in the popular nomenclature of the day, to not gaslight people, to not try to talk them out of their feelings, to dismiss them or discount their feelings. The more we can let our children feel, the more they'll recognize feelings in others. In other words, if our children are able to hurt and feel sad, and we're able to hold them in a nurturing way in our minds, in the relationship, the depth of that feeling will translate into them being able to recognize in other people, and that helps them develop empathy. It's when children learn not to feel, either because they're told not to feel, or for whatever reason, the feelings, the pain, the discomfort becomes so unbearable that they cut themselves out of, or they cut the feelings out of themselves, right? Then they become numb. They become non-feeling creatures, non-feeling beings, and therefore they don't see it in other people, and they're not really hurting other people. So healthy self-care and allowing people to feel and holding them in that space are the two kind of tasks that lead to it. But it's not entirely appropriate. What doesn't work is moralizing, preaching, teaching, shaming. Ironically, pointing out to somebody that they don't have empathy doesn't lead to greater empathy. But teaching somebody how to feel, or in other words, supporting them in a process of feeling more deeply, does teach them empathy. So it's counterintuitive, because we want people that are feeling a lack of empathy, we want them to feel guilty. But really what they need to learn to feel is everything. And there's plenty of research to support and demonstrate these principles. Somebody writes this question. Our 16-year-old son graduated from Evoke 2 months ago. He did really well at the program and is now back at his boarding school. His biological mom lives abroad and is borderline. He hasn't seen her for 5 years, and the plan is for him to go back to visit her this summer. She is already talking about how much she dislikes our lifestyle here and the use of therapy, and that we sent him to Evoke camp. Even though he knows better, it has been influencing his behavior negatively towards us. He had a plan to confront her and how she affected him, but now he says he won't be able to do it because he is afraid of her reaction and her potential to hurt him while he is there. How can we keep things cool and remind him about what he learned at Evoke? We're also worried about the fallback when he returns from there. Thank you. It's a great question. I don't know for sure if the answer that I'm about to give you guarantees anything, but I will tell you this. You know, as we engage in the process of supporting our children develop into a healthy person, into a healthy self, which is to say a self, right? A complete self, a whole self. Mind you, all along the way, learning and practicing and working through taking care of ourselves at the same time, or making sure that we're taking care of ourselves so other people don't have to. Supporting him in becoming a self means you don't have to control it, and then he can kind of go backwards and sideways for a while. I think that's one of the hardest things, right? The way I used to say it is, we allow our children to trip over a step and fall. We don't allow them, while we have them in our care, to fall down a flight of stairs. So we allow them to trip over a step, but we don't allow them to fall down a flight of stairs when they're under our care. So my instinct, based on your question, is he'll figure it out. Your confidence in him figuring it out will be your greatest contribution. Your anxiety and the attempt to control that comes out of the anxiety will not contribute and support his continued growth. So I think you can express yourself and let go. I don't know if you need to do that or not. You'd have to work that out kind of with your own therapist. But more than anything else, your lack of control will teach him that you're the safe person. And though we might all argue that you have more virtuous motivations than his mother, right? Even if all of us agreed with you, your attempt to kind of control it would be problematic. That's the strange irony of parenting, is that our attempts to control our children create in them a susceptibility to be vulnerable to people who try to control them. Isn't that ironic? We want our children to just be codependent on us. That is, we want them to worry about what we think and what we feel. And yet we don't want them to be codependent on other people, especially people we would identify as toxic. But you can't separate it out. The principle of codependency is too fundamental to the human experience. When we are anxious, and that anxiety drives us to try to manipulate or control our children, even if it's for what we deem the good cause, the good thing, the good outcome, we create a vulnerability in them. So if you feel you need to and you think you can hear it without taking it on, you can express your concerns and let it go. That could be okay. But more than anything, your implicit trust in him that he will figure it out will be the number one most powerful thing you could do to help him see that you're a safe person in his life. And he'll be able to contrast that kind of relationship, that quality in a relationship. He'll be able to contrast that with his biological mothers. And of course, we all know what virtually all human beings prefer when given the option, which is to be loved in that non-controlling way. Unless, of course, the conditioning, our conditioning, is so consistent and overwhelming that we start to equate that kind of control with love. And then we end up in toxic relationship with partners or with, in this case, a biological mom. Somebody writes, our son, now almost 18, was at Evoke over a year ago, followed by a residential treatment center. Within a month of coming home, he ran away, returning a few weeks later with a girlfriend. He did counseling for a couple of months and eventually returned to a school program where he is working to get his high school diploma this spring. For a while, his girlfriend essentially lived with us, but after increasing drama and breaking house rules, we had to set a boundary and they both left to live at her house, where substance use is acceptable. It is a very codependent relationship. I know he learned many tools from wilderness and aftercare, and he periodically reflects on how powerful the wilderness experience was for him. Right now, though, enmeshed with his girlfriend, he speaks disdainfully of therapy and treatment and resents us for sending him away. We continue to do our own work in both therapy and in Al-Anon and try our best to set boundaries that we can live with. Can you offer any suggestions around kids with oppositional defiance? I think that's a great question, a great example of something. It's similar to the last question that I raised, which is after wilderness treatment, after therapy, sometimes the insight and awareness goes dormant. In fact, it most often goes dormant. It's just like the trees outside of my window here that are just coming back to life as spring emerges. You know, some of them have looked dead all winter long. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. They look dead. They've been without leaves, without blossoms, just kind of the dead looking sticks. And it would be a mistake for me to believe that they were dead and then to treat them as such by uprooting them and throwing them away, for example. And so, like the last question I answered, it's kind of your job to support him. It's your job to you have the boundaries that you have to have. That's your decision that you feel safe and okay about in your family. You know, if you get held hostage by the fact that if he leaves your house, he will go out and be in a toxic relationship or be in an environment that supports substance abuse and so forth, you're still trying to control it, right? I mean, we're all held hostage by those kinds of outcomes and consequences. That's why we try to sometimes, that's why our boundaries are sometimes compromised, because if we set them, we lose control. That's in essence letting go. Letting go is healthy boundaries and the recognition that we can't control anything. Letting go is telling the truth. Letting go is saying no. And then when the person says, well, I'm just going to go live at so-and-so's house and I'm going to smoke pot there every day, our response is, and most of this, of course, is an internal dialogue, but we say, in essence, I can't control that. If that's what you want to do, You're welcome to. I'm not trying to get you to do anything or not do anything. I'm just establishing my boundaries. So it brings us back to kind of the origin of our boundaries. Are we trying to control them or not? And sometimes the only way that we know whether that's in play, our controlling instincts, is in examples like this where we set a boundary and somebody does something that we don't want and we feel the urge to capitulate or to reconsider or to kind of find another way to affect things that we want them to. So it's a very normal, it's kind of the run of the mill, if you will, question, in the sense that what happens when you set a boundary and somebody then responds with behaviors or situations that we actually find less desirable than before the boundary. And the idea is you let go. Going back to one of my slogans that I use all the time, you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose. So you get to decide. And I think it could be really harmful potentially. A little bit dangerous and risky for you, for example, to say, no, you can live with us and we'll capitulate on some of our boundaries. Unless that's what you want to do because you feel better about it. And sometimes this example that you've given us kind of lets you know, helps you identify the controlling instincts and ultimately decide if you want to let go of that instinct or resist it. I hope that helps. Kids with oppositional defiance in general is, it's understand their pain, understand their anger is trying to tell us something. They're trying to differentiate. I saw a tweet recently from a colleague that said that she believed, and it said, among other things, she thought that given what African American males go through in our society presently and over the last several hundred years, that she thought that oppositional defiant disorder should be excluded from the diagnostic manual for Black teens, for Black young people, boys specifically. And when I read that, I thought that doesn't make any sense, because oppositional defiant disorder is the symptom for all peoples, all colors, all genders, woundedness, right? It's a manifestation of a situation. It's kind of a last resort, last act. And so my thought to this tweet was, if it's good for them, it's good for all of them. It's just a description. All it is a description of a pattern of symptoms or behaviors that are protecting hurt or vulnerability or fear or sadness or trauma, right? It's a trauma response. Oppositional defiant disorder, like virtually all of disorders, are trauma responses. So my suggestion is stay out of the power struggle, like keep doing your work, like you're saying, but hear what the behavior is not telling you overtly. Listen so carefully that you can hear the scared little, insecure little, not knowing little boy. The boy who might be trying to define his independence by opposing what you're believing, who's trying to free himself out of the codependent relationship, who's trying to protect a much more vulnerable self that's buried in there. Somebody writes, even before COVID, I read and observed many college-age children are depressed, that the numbers are at an all-time high. What are your thoughts on this topic? I know I was too back in the Stone Ages, but my daughter has struggled with depression while away, and while I try to delicately encourage her to see a therapist, I try not to control the situation. She is definitely a traumatized child of a traumatized child. Her prior experience in therapy was not with an experienced therapist, and I feel this is one of her barriers. I think like all of these thank you for the question. I think like all of these kinds of questions, I think you can ask them gently if they're okay with the dialogue. Like exploring how previous therapeutic contexts hurt her would be a very valuable discussion. Talking about how you'll try to stay away from trying to influence her one direction or the other. I have somebody that's close to me, and we were talking about the vaccine, about getting the vaccine or not. And I asked the question, I said, are you open to a dialogue about it? Before I said anything, are you open to discussing it? Can I ask you questions? And they said, yes, I'm open to talking about it, and I'm happy to be asked questions. And I checked in on him more than just those couple of times throughout the conversation, because I wanted to make sure that I was giving him permission to take care of himself. So you can have a dialogue, you can have a discussion, you can bring up thoughts and ideas. That's always okay if you check in on the front end about where their boundaries are or not. I think that there could very well be some explanations. And having said all of that, it might need to get worse for her. You know, I haven't told this story on a podcast in years, I think. But several years ago, we invited my therapist, Jamie Gill. Her author name is J.D. Gill. We invited her to present at one of the conferences that we were hosting, therapeutic conferences. And she gave a beautiful, wonderful, insightful talk. And subsequent to her talk, everybody was in the lounge area talking in various groups, and several people had gathered around Jamie and were connecting with her and asking her questions. And a colleague of mine said, you know, I drink in the evening, not to excess, but I drink to relax. I drink to unwind. I drink to turn off my brain. And it works for me. But sometime around 4 in the morning, I'll often wake up with my anxiety all right back on full volume. And my colleague asked Jamie, she said, do you have any suggestions for that? And Jamie said, I know the answer to this one. So, of course, our ears perked up, and we were waiting for her to give us her wise and sage advice. And Jamie said this. She said, what you do is you put a bottle of scotch on your bedside table. And when you wake up at 4 o'clock with anxiety, take a long, big drink of the scotch that's on your table. And everybody was kind of perplexed. And I realized what she was doing. She was giving such a silly and ridiculous answer to a question. She was using humor to point out the inevitable or the implicit, which is you can figure this out. You can get medication for anxiety. You can learn to meditate. Maybe sobriety is what you need. Maybe you can listen to the anxiety. There's a whole host of solutions that she didn't offer because the answer was too simple. It was too easy. If she had answered with any of the examples that I just gave, that woman, my colleague, would have likely kind of swatted it down and explained how it wouldn't work or that she'd tried it before. So Jamie used a ridiculous answer to highlight you can figure this out. And so part of the message tonight is all of you are parents that are parents, have the right to set boundaries in whatever way you want to with your children. I or anybody else can't take those away and can't tell you what to do in those areas. And part of our support of our children is to allow them to kind of make a mess as they go, to make mistakes and learn from it, to figure it out for themselves. And for us to be regulated, in other words, calm enough, so when their dysregulation or anxiety meets our regulation, we call this co-regulating, they feel a calm sense from us, right? And so Jamie didn't say, well, maybe this sounds like you might have an alcohol or a substance use problem. She took it to the absurd level to highlight the idea that you can figure it out. You can figure it out for yourself without saying that. Somebody writes, I understand that a therapeutic boarding school or residential treatment center is the recommended step after wilderness therapy, but what if it is just financially not possible and all the other avenues have been exhausted? I can't help but have a feeling of impending doom because other options, if there are any, are not discussed much. Great question. I'm going to click to this slide. This slide is the answer. For those of you that are just listening to it, the slide that I'm clicking on is the one that has the 12-step support groups. Al-Anon for alanon.org or at alanon.org. Codependence Anonymous, go to coda.org. Families Anonymous is familiesanonymous.org. And Adult Children of Alcoholics is adultchildren.org. These are free. And these are where people go where they're either financially not able to, emotionally not able to, legally not able to kind of manage the behavior outside of themselves. This is where you go when you love somebody who's practicing self-sabotaging behaviors compulsively, where they can't be reasoned with, and where you may have lost the legal ability to kind of control them like we can with our children under the age of 8, at least 18. At least those children, we can put them in a certain place. But it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if they've aged out, right? Or if you don't have money, or if you just feel like I've done enough. Maybe you do have more money that you could throw at it, right? But you can still arrive at like, I've done my best and now I'm going to turn it over to you. But these groups, these 12-step groups offer you support because that's a very terrifying, frightening, lonely, painful, list the adjectives that are unpleasant. It's a very terrifying place to be, a very sad and hopeless and powerless place to be. So you go to meetings where other people are in the same situation. And you go there so that you won't be alone, so that other people can support you with love and in love, in a loving environment. And at some point, we have to do this work of detachment, this work of letting go, no matter what, even if we have enough money to pay for programming the rest of our lives. We are still invited, we are still asked by the situation to practice a kind of a detachment, which, as I teach, is the same thing as attachment. And the work that we do at Evoke in self-psychology, right? In attachment theory, healthy attachment is healthy detachment. Okay? They're the same thing. They're the same thing. It's the right amount of attachment to the right things, if you will. That's what healthy attachment and healthy detachment are. There's another question here. Cassidy says, I missed a question. I don't see it, Cassidy. I don't see it in the public chat. Will you post it again? Even before COVID, that one? The one that starts off, no, not that one. Oh, our son, that one that starts off, our son. Our son, now almost 18, was that a vote? Sorry, everybody. I don't know what happened. I just got kicked out. So I'm back now. Cassie, I don't know what question we were on. I couldn't find the one that you said that I didn't answer. So if you want to post it in our private chat, um, or tell me what it starts with, what the first three words are. Can you hear me now? I read that, Cassidy. I answered that. Yeah, I read that. Even before COVID, I read and observed many college-age children are depressed. Okay, here we go. Back to the beginning. Another question reads, knowing the intent of someone when they say you're a good dad, what is an appropriate response? I get that it's meant to make me feel good about myself and make them feel more empathic and better about themselves, proclaiming that. Admittedly, I do feel better about myself when certain people say it, but I'm bugged when others say it. I know such a statement is meaningless, but it seems like I should at least acknowledge it. Do I just say thank you and move on? Seems disingenuous. Must be a Bob Dylan analogy in there somewhere. Yeah. You know, you could if the person, the point doesn't matter to you. I think saying thank you is fine, right? If it's an acquaintance and you don't want to get into it, um, you know what I like to say, if it's anything that matters, is just if somebody were to compliment me on being a good dad, my response is, yeah, I do the best I can, but I screw up a hell of a lot, right? I mean, it doesn't, and I think what you can sense from them, I think you can sense from them if it comes from an anxious place. I remember after doing a staff in service, I went out to the field, to the group, and one of the staff members who had just sat through my teaching in service said, in front of the girls in the group, said, when is it appropriate to teach, to come in and to make your point? And I asked her for an example, and it was something like this, something encouraging like this. And I said to her, you know, all I can tell you is what it feels like to me, if and when you were to say that, is it feels needy to me. It doesn't feel connected to me. So if the conversation and the relationship is important to you, I think you can ask questions like, tell me what you mean by that. Or why would you say that? Or, you know, just ask them about, like, what does that mean? Where's that coming from? Kind of question. And then talk to them about that you're learning that being good is a fool's errand. That being good, I said this a few weeks ago on one of the podcasts. The defense across the board is about us trying to be good. And we must give up trying to be good to become a person, to become whole, to become aware, to become enlightened, to become accountable, to be in relationship with other people that we care about. Because good will fight and scratch and claw to be good. But whole or complete or real, that just kind of comes, right? So you can ask questions about what they mean. You can teach about what you've learned. You can just react to it that way. And again, if it's an acquaintance and it's somebody that you're not really, the discussion isn't that important, you could just say thank you and move on. That happens to me sometimes. Someone will say something in passing politely, and I'm not in the mood to have a 20-minute conversation about it. But if the person, the principle, and the person is important to me and I have the time, then I can unravel it through asking questions and through talking about my perspective. You know, again, I can't connect. I can't connect, and I don't want to connect to the idea that I'm a good father, a good husband, or a good person. I don't want to be that. Carl Jung, it's one of his most famous quotes ever was, "I would rather be whole than good." And what I've learned as a therapist and as a therapy client is that's what we're all striving for when we already are good, right? We're already okay. It's what Khalil Gibran says in The Prophet when he talks about good and evil. Of the good in you I can speak, but not of the evil. Because evil is just something that is tortured by its own thirst, right? Oh, that reminds me. My very favorite quote that I've read in a long time. I can't write it. Maybe I can write it here. Well, I won't write it, but I'll read it to you. I read it in a book last week. It's so amazing. I put it on my social media. It's by the author Charles Eisenstein. I'm almost finished with his book, so I'm gonna run out of his quotes soon. Charles Eisenstein said, "Evil is a consequence, not a cause." Can you type that out for them in quotes, Cassidy? Evil is a consequence, comma, not a cause. And what he talked about was he was basically speaking that the things that people do that we call evil come from trauma, come from wounding. And we think of evil as this original state of being, right? And I joked with it. I shared it with a friend over the weekend, that quote that I'd read, and he kind of teased me about it. And I joked with him. I said, the movie, you've seen The Grinch That Stole Christmas starring Jim Carrey, right? Like it's there. Every backstory of every supervillain, it's there. The origin story tells us how they arrived at where they are. It's not a simple cause and effect, but we can trace their quote unquote evil. We can trace it back to this wounding, back to this trauma. Somebody writes, "I'm torn, heartbroken, and continuing to do my work. My son is 17 and has been in wilderness and is in a therapeutic boarding school. He struggled in wilderness and is now struggling at a therapeutic boarding school with anger with me for me sending him away, saying he wasn't doing anything different than any other teenager. What should I be doing differently?" I'm not sure you can control that. I think you can understand and listen. You can thank him for, I don't know, you don't want to sound, you don't want to be contrived. You don't want to sound patronizing, but in essence, let him feel it. Let it sit. Let it be. When we don't fight back, they have to sort themselves out. A power struggle is not a one-sided thing. And a power struggle, in essence, on our side of things, is often trying to get somebody to think and feel and believe something. So when you let it go through you, when you let it sit, when you say, okay, when you admit, I don't know the right answer, it's my best guess and I could be wrong, and I can see your anger and you have a right to be mad at me. I mean, all of that's true. So I would say, let it be. And then what that requires of him, or what it leaves him with, is that he's got to figure it out that it's not about you. But he says it because he expects for it to work, right? He expects for it to weigh on you. I shared this story last week twice, but I'm going to share it again because it's so good. It's also from Charles Eisenstein. He goes around the world teaching about global warming, but teaching about it on a spiritual level, like it's evidence of our individual spiritual, our spiritual issues that get manifest in consumerism and so forth and so on until it leads to the rainforest being burnt down or whatever. And as he's giving his lectures, at one point, a woman walks up to him at the end of his lecture and said, "How do you justify flying all over in airplanes and speaking about climate change when you know of the dramatic impact of air travel, of burning of fossil fuels on the environment. How do you justify it? She asks him. And he said, I don't justify it. I don't. And she was confused because she couldn't imagine a world where somebody isn't justified, right? You have to be good. And Mr. Eisenstein said, I just do it because I like to. I do it because I like it, but I don't justify it. And she was, again, perplexed by this and confused. And she said to him, what if everybody in the world just went around doing everything that they wanted to do? And in essence, he said, I think the world would be a much, much better place, which is very confusing to this kind of person, this person that's in that sensibility. I hear that a lot from people. But that's, the Taoist way, right? The Buddhist way, right? That's the existentialists believe this, right? It's you do what you want to, and if you do it mindfully, you won't want to do it. You won't want to do those things that people call unhealthy or toxic or harmful or cruel. Not because you shouldn't do those things, but because you don't want it to, because you're connected to yourself and you're connected to everybody else. So my answer is understand, compassion, empathy, express even gratitude that he's telling you. Try not to be condescending or contrived. But man, if he can be safe to tell you that he's mad at you and disagrees with you, that means you're helping him build a sense of self. And then he'll go out in the world and he won't get himself in relationships with authority figures, bosses, employers, spouses, partners, children, where he needs to be right. You're modeling for him that you're just human and you're doing the best you can, and it might be wrong. Somebody says, what are your thoughts on EMDR for trauma? I think if it works, do it. And a lot of people claim that it works. It's kind of a more primitive version of brain spotting, which some of our therapists are certified in both of these techniques. So I'm fine with it. Anything that would help you access your trauma, help you make sense out of it. When I have clients ask me about EMDR, I'll give them a recommendation for somebody that I know that does EMDR or brain spotting. I don't do it myself as a client because I don't find the need to, because I find access to my trauma pretty easily. But for those people that are blocked, for those people that might be overthinking, right? Their defense is to kind of intellectualize everything and dissociate into their thoughts. EMDR can be a great way to ground them and to access unconscious or preconscious traumas or examples. So if it works, and I think it does, it makes sense to me. If EMDR and brain spotting work for you or work for somebody, or you're not finding yourself having success in traditional attachment-based therapy like we do here, then adding that to the repertoire is fantastic. And I say that as a therapist or as a friend. Give it a try if you want to. It makes good sense scientifically. Somebody writes, I recently had an epiphany of the why behind our 15-year-old son being so resistant to repairing our relationship or wanting to come home with us after his program. It's that we trigger him. He feels deep shame for disappointing us. I don't think he can articulate this yet, but feel I am pretty accurate on this insight. Advice on how to proceed in our communication to him if I'm indeed right. For me, it would sound something like, I have this strange idea, or I've had this thought. And then you just put it out there simply. The most important thing in encountering somebody's defenses, somebody's resistance, is not the first suggestion that you offer, but it is if and when they resist the idea and you are attached to it. I teach this to therapists. You float out ideas. I have a thought. I have an idea. I have a theory. Something just came to me. Here's the story I'm thinking about right now. Here's what I think I heard. On and on and on. And then you see how the person responds. And if it can be developed, you keep going with the conversation. But if they're like, no, that's not it, or that doesn't fit, or no, you're wrong, or you don't get it, or you don't understand, you drop it. You drop it. I teach parents and therapists. The mistake isn't the first thing, it's the second and the third and the fourth attempt to push that agenda, to push that idea. So he's either not ready to hear it if you put it out there, or he's got such defenses that he can't be conscious of it. But I think floating it out there is an idea. And even giving him examples. Talking about how I was talking to a client about this today. This idea that it's such a strange concept that in our culture, with Homo sapiens, we are often encouraged in the dominant culture to apologize for how our wounding, our issues, affects those that care about us. Of course it does affect those that care about us. But the idea that I have to apologize to you for my wounds and my behaviors and my stuckness, that instinct to apologize gives you a glimpse into how small the parents have been, right? The larger the parents are, the more they say it wasn't about hurting me. Of course I was worried, but that's not the point. I get worried about lots of stuff. I get worried about things all the time. But what I was hoping is that you would be okay. And I'm sorry that I made you feel like it was your obligation to come and apologize to me for your wounding. That's critical. The larger we get, the more likely we are to respond that way. The smaller we are, of course, we'll ask and expect for apologies. It's why we don't do the impact letter anymore, because we believe it is fundamentally at odds with what we know about child development and the parent-child relationship and attachment theory. Somebody writes this question. Recently, I was talking to my therapist about the ways I try to do things different with my children than the way I was parented. I was wondering if I was trying to get my needs met through my children. My therapist suggested that part of the process of bonding with our infants is a mutual process of getting needs met. Can you address the difference between this and the work you advocate we do? I'm not exactly sure what point your therapist was trying to make. Of course, having children is an extraordinarily rewarding experience, right? It gives us a greater sense of purpose and meaning. We find great joy in holding and loving our children. That's a fact. And so I don't think that is at odds with the fact that we are primarily responsible for holding our children, not vice versa. And that the way we react and feel and think about our children has very, very large, profound implications and results, right? That it has an impact on them. So I don't know that the two are in competition with each other at all. And I don't know that I would know very many people who have really studied child development who would argue with that a child is not built to hold a parent, that a child is not built to make a parent happy or feel fulfilled. And that if a child engages in those tasks, it's going to come at a great cost to their authenticity, to their integration, to the development of their self. And so I don't know exactly. On a very simple level, of course, there's joy. But what I just explained, I don't know that I understand a reasonable argument against it. And the only reasonable argument against it, it's not even reasonable, is that everybody in the world believes that it's true. That's the argument against it. is that everybody believes that it's a child's job to make a parent proud and happy. That's the only argument I know against it, is that everybody does it that way, virtually. And just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of humans on Earth are doing it differently. And that includes therapists. Someone writes, family and friends are eager to offer help with my struggling child. When I set a boundary by asking them to just listen while I vent, they usually honor that boundary. But sometimes my child's struggles will become the topic within another broader discussion. And help or advice is offered before I have a chance to set a boundary. How's the best way to react? I think just pausing, just saying, hey, I'm having this feeling right now. I'm having this reaction about the discussion that we're in right now, and I'm feeling like it's getting kind of advicey for me, and I don't want that, or I don't need that, or I'm not asking. I mean, it's just gently talk about your reaction and what you're perceiving, what you're hearing, and then reflecting that back. And if they are relatively healthy, so to speak, they'll respond graciously. They'll respond well. And if they're defended because they need to be good and they need you to see them as good and loving, then you'll get a defense. You'll get an explanation about how they weren't doing it or what they really meant, what was really intended. So you'll get a sense, if you share kind of how it's hitting you, you'll get a sense of where they're at and where their capacity is at. And it might lead to you setting a bigger boundary, which is, I'd prefer that we not talk about my son or my daughter or my family's struggles. Somebody writes, I understand, quote, you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose, unquote, on an intellectual level, but sometimes it feels very defeating and heavy, sad and hopeless, like being on the losing team forever. As I write this, I know through experience there are bright moments, but sometimes I miss the feeling of the intense joy of a win. Yep. That's all I have to say to that one is, yep. I know. It actually, when you extricate yourself out of this world of right and wrong, or as you do it, I more accurately should say, it can be absolutely devastating. It can lead to dark and deep depression, because you realize when you wake up the infinite numbers of ways that you've hurt people and mistreated people, including your children. And so as that awareness comes to the surface and you still have a part of you that thinks the goal is to be good or right or perfect or correct, it leads to a feeling of absolute depression, deflation. It's a horribly dark place. And that's why it's really valuable for me and us to be together and to talk about it, to not be alone in it, to have somebody support me as I kind of transition out of that, or those moments when I take, very, very long strides out of that place of being right or good or correct. And for those of you that are new, the result is not a worse parent, just to be clear. The result is a better parent, a more capable parent, a more loving parent, a more authentic parent, a more courageous parent, a less anxious parent, on and on and on. Somebody writes, I understand that trite saying, a parent is only as happy as their least happy child, is really the saying. But this reads this way. I understand the trite saying that a parent is only as happy as their child is crazy. I believe that. I'm doing my work. Yet every time I get a call from the therapist about my son struggling, it hits me so hard. How long does this work take to really be okay and let go? All I can do is feel the feeling, but try to take care of myself. But the truth is that it's affecting my serenity and wisdom. I'll answer the first part of the question. How long does it take? I'll let you know when I arrive. When I arrive at the finish line, I promise all of you, I will stop right there. I'll turn around to those of you still running the race, and I'll let you know what it feels like. In other words, we're always working on it. I think you can share this with your therapist, your child's therapist. If your child is in a program, you could say, it's too heavy. I don't want to hear all of it. It's okay to distance yourself from the news and from the details. Really. More than that, if your child is struggling and you don't want to bury your head in the sand, although that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for boundaries. But let's say you think that's burying your head in the sand, so you don't want to do that. Just sit with other imperfect parents who are a little farther along on the journey, who have made some peace with the reality, the realization that we dent our children, right? And if I think about this and unfold this question even more, it speaks to a generational message, I'm sure, where it's the parent's job to get it right, to be the expert, to be something like perfect, or at least have near perfect intentions. And so this is also something this struggle is telling you about your traumatic childhood and what you believe about being a child and a parent from your childhood. And I think there's value in kind of seeing it play itself out in that way and healing and unpacking that toxic idea or set of ideas. Thank you. Last question. Our son is about to leave wilderness therapy at Evoke. Can you comment on home plans? Our son does not want to have one because he does not want to be controlled. Well, if he's under 8, I mean, I don't like home plans that they sign off on. I like home plans that are like, here's the deal. I'm open to any suggestions, but ultimately, if he's under 18 or she's under 18 or they're under 18, you get to decide. And if they're over 18, you get to decide on the conditions, right? So my answer is, I'm sure he doesn't like it. That makes sense. Make sure you're doing your work. Make sure you're clear on where your boundaries are coming from. Make sure you're learning to let go while still hold very clear boundaries. And then let him not like it. But it's I don't like contracts, home contracts, because they're most often taught as a solution. And then if the child agrees to it, then you can hold them to that agreement. I've never seen them work. I've never seen a home contract work, ever. The only way that they can work is when a parent uses it to get clear with themselves or with their co-parent. When you do it so that you can remove any self-doubt that you had been unclear. It's for you, but it will not do the work for you, and they'll come up with any loophole, any excuse, and they will rightly respond that they signed it under duress. And they'll be right because they did. So it's for you. And it's okay for him to. I've used it in the wilderness as a discussion with the child, say, I don't think it's going to work if you go home and do this. Like, this is your parents' rules. They say no pot. You say you still could use pot. I'm pretty sure we're going to be at that crossroads again. So I've used that as a therapist to kind of help the child see that they're asking for something that doesn't exist anymore. They're hoping for a scenario or a situation that's a fantasy. All right, folks. Some announcements upcoming. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. Also, the new audiobook of The Audacity to Be You is out in my voice. If you would like to do an in-person intensive to do a deep dive in your own work, the next available slot is in June 9th through 13th. You can also do them online. We have them split into 2 parts, part 1 and 2. If you've been to a Finding You in person, Finding You, you can come to our program that we used to call Finding You 2. We have renamed it Returning to You. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits trips are adventure trips all over the world, anywhere from 3 to 30 days. Can be with adults, young adults, or families. So if you want a therapy light, kind of a reconnection to therapy, adventure trips, pursuits of adventure trips are an option. Also, you can use it between programs or at the end of programs. We have support groups for wilderness current families and alumni. The next one is May 6th at 6:30 p.m. And for our intensives program, the next one is May 11th at 6 p.m. Just email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. We ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast platform. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. Go to any of your podcast apps and also like and subscribe and rate us there. Also, you can go to soundcloud.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram by using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or you can find @EvokeTherapy Intensives on Instagram. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, the Evoke Therapy blog has new content each week. All right, my next broadcast will be May 3rd at 6:30 p.m. I'm going to be doing an intensive the rest of the week, so I'll be unavailable for the rest of the week. But I'll be back on May 3rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about Chapter 8, the second to the last chapter out of the Journey of the Heroic Parent, talking about boundaries and parenting. So I look forward to that. Thank you for joining me. Thank you on behalf of your children for your willingness to do your work. And I hope this is a helpful point of contact for all of you. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.